many of you might have read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? Can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Mostly from my generation. This book can be understood in any number of ways, as can Zen. It's a novel about a father and son taking a road trip across the upper Midwest and the far West. It's also about a middle-aged man's obsession with the mechanics and maintenance of his vintage motorcycle. I figured Jack would enjoy a story about that. It's also a philosophical treatise on the metaphysical concept of value. It's also about a schizophrenic's heroic struggle to regain his sanity, or maybe at least make peace with the reality of his disease. Perhaps most importantly, it's also about the healing of a relationship between a father and a son. I've said all that about the book, but I'm here to confess it is not an easy read. The first time I slogged through this was when I was in college in the mid-1970s. And I had been compelled to read the book mostly because of the cult status that it was assuming very soon after its publication. When I got to the end of that first reading, it's, it involves a commitment. I asked myself after that first reading, what was that about? I had spent a dozen or so hours with my eyes glazed over as I sifted through all these long passages about this philosophical discourse when I should have been studying for my college exams. And most of the time I really didn't have any idea about what I was reading. Reading the book without a guide is much like trying to learn Zen without an instructor. However, though I didn't realize it at the time, that question I asked, what was that about, was my first lesson in Zen. I would only come to realize that years later, when I really started to learn more about Zen, being a training ground in paradox. Paradox, of course, being two things that at first blush seem to be totally incongruent, but in the end up being quite congruent. Well, I lost my first copy of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. You know how it is when you're in college and you're moving dorms to living with your buddies in a house near campus and shifting stuff around, going home for holidays. And you might think, well, that's too bad. But it really wasn't. I didn't miss it. I did not miss it. But my interest in the book would be totally rekindled later, because I was reading another book that kept referring back to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. And so I sort of had my interest rekindled. And so I went and bought another copy. This copy was slightly different because an afterword, about a 16-page afterword, had been added to the book that completely transforms the meaning of the entire story. My second lesson in and being so glad that I had lost my first copy. For those of you who haven't read the book, let me get you up to speed. The story begins with Pirzig and his son Chris being emotionally estranged. And they had been estranged ever since Pirzig's hospitalization for his mental illness. Chris is 12 years old when they began this 17-day journey across the Midwest and the Far West. And they have a few adventures along the way. They make friends and have campfires and so forth. And through their experiences, many of the raw wounds of their past are brought to the surface. And Chris and his father are forced to confront each other. By the end of the story, they have gained a much better understanding of each other and what led to their estrangement. And that's how the original version of the book ended. Now, in this second edition, the one I purchased 10 years later, Chris is now 22. And Chris is a Zen student at the Zen Center in San Francisco. One evening, Chris walks out of the Zen Center and is accosted by two men. According to witnesses, one of the men grabs Chris from behind. The other man empties his pockets and, finding nothing there, becomes very angry with him. And Chris says something to the man that makes him even angrier. And the man in front of Chris takes out a kitchen knife and plunges it into Chris's chest. And the two men jump in their car and drive off. Chris staggers down the street, bleeding profusely from what would later be found to be a severed pulmonary artery, and dies in just a few moments. This is the event that Pirzig relates in the afterword to the book. How does anyone deal with the loss of a child? Here's how Pirzig dealt with it. In his own words, I go on living more out of habit than anything else. Like any philosopher, he asked himself philosophical questions. Where did Chris go? He asked himself that question until he began to obsess over it. So deep was the grief over the loss of his son that he had been estranged from and was now in such a good relationship with. Where did Chris go? He had bought an airline ticket that very morning. He had a bank account, drawers full of clothes, and shelves full of books. He was a real live person, occupying space and time on this planet. Now, suddenly, where had he gone to? Did he go up the stack at the crematorium? Was he in that little box of bones that they handed back to him? Was he strumming a harp of gold on some overhead cloud? None of these answers made any sense or offered any consolation to Pirzig. Again, continuing with Pirzig's own words, it had to be asked, what was it that I was so attached to? Was it just something in my imagination? When you've spent time in a mental hospital, That's never a trivial question. If Chris wasn't just imaginary, then where did he go? Do real things just disappear, just like that? The grief-stricken Pirzig obsesses, ponders, questions, and begins to move from the material world to the spiritual. Again, in his words, what had to be seen was that the Chris I missed so badly was not an object, but a pattern. And that although the pattern that included the flesh and blood of Chris, that was not all there was to it. The pattern was larger than Chris and myself. And the pattern related to us in ways that neither one of us understood completely. And neither of us was in complete control of. Now, Chris's body was gone, but the larger pattern remained. Yes, a huge hole had been torn out of the center of it. And that's what caused all the heartache. The pattern was looking for something to reattach itself to and couldn't find anything. This was Pirzig's state of mind when he and his wife discovered, quite unexpectedly, that they were pregnant. After careful discussion, they decided that the pregnancy was not something that should continue. And so they made the necessary medical appointment. Pirzig was by this time in his 50s, and they were still struggling with his mental illness and with their grief. And then, in Pirzig's words again, something very strange happened. As we went over the decision one last time, there was this kind of dissociation, and my wife started to recede from me as we sat there talking. And I said, "Wait, stop. Something's wrong." What it was unknown, but it was intense, and I didn't want it to continue. It was a really frightening thing, which has since become clearer. It was just the larger pattern of Chris making itself known again to us. We reversed our decision and now realize what a catastrophe it would have been for us if we hadn't. So I guess you could say, in a primitive way of understanding things, that Chris got his airline ticket after all. This time, he's a little girl named Nell, and our life is back in perspective again. The hole in the pattern is being mended. What is seen now so much more clearly is that although the names keep changing and the bodies keep changing, the larger pattern that holds us together goes on and on. The larger pattern that holds us together goes on and on. Even when someone we love dies, there is a pattern to that relationship, a way that our life has become interwoven with theirs. And that pattern continues even when that person is no longer physically with us. It is that pattern that imparts a kind of immortality to our lives. Because of the patterns that we weave with family and friends, in communities, the pattern of our lives goes on. And that pattern changes the world in ways that we can scarcely comprehend. You know, it's a difficult thing to be a Unitarian Universalist minister, isn't it, Jack? I say that because our faith is a hard sell. Think about it with me. What is it that we have to offer people? Think about what we're competing with. Other churches offer eternal life, heaven, pearly gates and streets of gold. It's pretty hard to compete with all that. And the theology behind those ideas is backed up by the Bible and is reinforced by humanity's fear of death, the mystery of death. What can we offer in a world that seems so bereft sometimes of any meaning, and that all people seem to want is just assurance of comfort in this life and reward in the next? Our faith tradition has no established belief about the afterlife. Like all matters of faith, we are encouraged to believe only those things that ring true for us. Some of us hold that this is it. There is no spirit or consciousness that goes on after bodily death. Some of us believe in reincarnation, or that our spirit or our consciousness will rejoin with some cosmic consciousness. The ideas out there among us are about as diverse as they are about other things in spirituality and religion. But we can say that, in general, our members place much more emphasis on the importance of what happens in this life. Our ultimate concern is much more this worldly, much more concerned with creating heaven on earth. And it is that focus on this worldliness that comprises part of what I think we have to offer the world. In death, we don't hold funerals. We have memorial services, and we share memories of the life of the one who is no longer with us, but in some ways is now more with us than ever. That's pretty sin, isn't it? We're all about a theology of life, even in the midst of death. When you think about it, isn't that really all that any of us really want? To be remembered? To have friends and family call up the pattern of our life and to recall how it was interwoven with theirs and created this wonderful tapestry of meaning and value. Yes, in life, our emphasis is on this life, this world. We gather in our larger communities on Sunday mornings to worship. Worship, in the truest sense of worship. We don't sing praises to an egotistical God who demands our adoration and worship. we come together to shape worth. That's the actual meaning of the word worship, to shape worth. We do that by sitting in contemplation together, speaking of matters of ultimate concern, sharing our stories and our ideas about things that will make the world a better place and make us a better person. Our congregational life is not about pie in the sky by and by. It's about living a better life in the here and now. As Pirzig says in his book, quote, "The place to improve the world is first in one's own heart and head and hands, and then work outward from there. Other people can talk about how to expand the destiny of mankind. I just want to talk about how to fix a motorcycle." There is a humble acknowledgement in the ways that we listen to one another, that we accept one another, despite our differences, maybe because of our differences, that speaks a truth beyond our words. In that acceptance, aren't we really saying to each other, none of us has the answers, but together we can still learn some great truths? And isn't that really about as good as it gets in this life? To be in the presence of fellow seekers, caring companions. To be with others with whom we share the pattern of our life, and perhaps even discover patterns in that life that we might not have known even existed. And to know that here, more than anywhere else, there are others in the world that share that vision of this world and this life. We recognize that every pattern is unique, that every pattern is one of worth and dignity. When we participate in the life of this community, we are in the midst of others who recognize that our life is a pattern as well, and that that pattern contributes significantly to the tapestry of life. In this community, there are others who are present to us, who relate to us in ways that will say to us when we're gone that yes, there will be a huge hole in the pattern. That's what makes our congregation special. For me, that's what we have to offer. And that's what we can offer in a way that no other community can. In the end, that's all we have to offer. Perhaps that's all that any faith has to offer. We have each other in the way we care for each other. It doesn't sound like much compared to eternal life. But it must be enough. Somehow it is enough. There's a lot of zen in that. If we will only quieten ourselves enough for its realization to come to us. May it be so.